Behind the towering stone walls of Auburn Correctional Facility lies a brutal legacy, a prison so old and unforgiving that it changed the history of American punishment forever. Auburn Correctional Facility stands as one of the oldest and most historically significant prisons in the United States, with roots stretching back to 1816. Its establishment came at a time when America was still in the early stages of shaping its criminal justice system, and the country was exploring new methods of punishment, discipline, and behavioral reform. Auburn did not simply open as another prison. It opened as a laboratory of ideas, philosophies, and experimental systems that would influence penitentiaries across the nation for more than a century. When Auburn was first constructed, the United States was grappling with the question of how best to deal with criminals in a growing post-revolutionary society. Earlier systems inherited from colonial rule often relied on public humiliation, stocks, severe corporal punishment, or banishment. But as the 19th century began, the government started moving toward institutional confinement, keeping prisoners in secure buildings not only as punishment but as a means of reshaping their behavior. Auburn became one of the first major tests of this emerging philosophy. The facility was designed with a commanding architectural presence, its massive walls and fortress-like structure symbolizing the power and authority of the state. Entering Auburn was meant to impress upon prisoners a psychological shock, a physical reminder that the world they once knew had been stripped away and replaced with an unforgiving system that demanded order, silence, obedience, and labor. Unlike jails of earlier generations, Auburn's purpose was not simply to confine, but to control every element of a prisoner's life. In its early years, Auburn became the birthplace of the famous Auburn System, a regimented approach that contrasted sharply with the Pennsylvania system, another influential model of the time. Whereas the Pennsylvania model emphasized total solitary confinement, Auburn combined isolation with collective labor. Prisoners worked together during the day but were forced to remain in silence at all times. The idea was that social interaction without communication, working side by side while never speaking, would break down individuality, reduce the spread of criminal ideas, and enforce discipline at a psychological level. The Auburn system represented a shift toward prisons being seen as factories of reform. Inmates worked long hours producing goods such as furniture, tools, textiles, shoes, and metal items. This labor served two purposes. First, to provide structure and instill a work ethic, and second, to generate revenue for the prison. In many periods of its early history, Auburn's industrial operations successfully funded a large portion of its own operating costs. The willingness to turn incarceration into an economic system would go on to influence prisons all across the United States for generations. Being one of the oldest prisons also means Auburn has been a witness to American history itself. It survived the Civil War, the transformation of the nation's justice system, the Industrial Revolution, shifting political philosophies, and countless debates on prison reform. During these eras, Auburn held thousands of inmates, many of whom experienced firsthand the harsh conditions that became its defining characteristic. Prisoners endured strict schedules, heavy labor, cramped cells, severe punishments for disobedience, and limited personal freedom. These conditions became the subject of intense debate among activists, reformers, journalists, and political leaders who questioned whether Auburn's approach represented true justice or mere institutional brutality. Over the decades, Auburn became a training ground not only for prisoners but for prison administrators from across the country who visited to study the model. Many states copied its architectural layout, daily structure, and disciplinary policies, turning Auburn into a national prototype for incarceration. The Auburn system also helped pave the way for future maximum security institutions, inspiring many of the rules and restrictions that later defined 20th century prisons. Being one of the oldest prisons also means Auburn has accumulated layers of stories, both tragic and transformative. Generations of inmates lived and died within its walls. Some entered as petty offenders and emerged as hardened criminals, while others reformed quietly, learning new skills or trades during their sentences. Auburn's long history includes riots, uprisings, labor strikes, administrative scandals, debates over ethics, and arguments about whether punishment should serve as revenge, deterrence, rehabilitation, or something in between. Even in modern times, Auburn remains a functioning correctional facility, making it not just a historic monument but a living institution that bridges past and present. Unlike many historic prisons that have been converted into museums or abandoned sites, Auburn continues to house inmates and operate under the authority of New York's correctional system. This continuity means that the same halls that once saw the earliest experiments in American prison philosophy are still in use today, reminding both staff and inmates of the weight of history behind every decision and policy. Today, Auburn stands as a symbol of the transformation of American punishment. It is a reminder of how far the system has come, and how much of its early ideology still remains embedded in modern correctional practices. The bricks, corridors, and cell blocks of Auburn tell a long and complex story of discipline, power, social control, economic interests, and evolving ideas of justice that began over 200 years ago and still influence American prison life today. Auburn Correctional Facility is widely recognized as the birthplace of the Auburn System, a prison model that would profoundly influence the development of correctional facilities throughout the United States and even internationally. Established in the early 19th century, Auburn was not just a building to confine criminals. It was an experimental institution designed to test new ideas about discipline, rehabilitation, and the role of labor in shaping prisoner behavior. The development of the Auburn system marked a radical departure from earlier approaches to punishment, which often relied heavily on public humiliation, corporal punishment, or solitary confinement. Before the Auburn system emerged, prisons in America were largely chaotic, overcrowded, and unregulated. Inmates were often left to their own devices, resulting in disorder, violence, and the spread of criminal behavior. Reformers of the time believed that punishment should not only restrain offenders but also correct their behavior through strict discipline, moral instruction, and labor. Auburn became the laboratory for this ideology, combining structure, labor, and silence in a manner that was unprecedented in American penology. The core principle of the Auburn system was the enforced silence rule. Prisoners were prohibited from speaking at any time, whether during work, meals, or even while walking through the prison corridors. Any violation of this rule could result in immediate punishment, ranging from solitary confinement to physical beatings. Silence was intended to suppress communication among inmates, thereby reducing the spread of criminal ideas and fostering obedience. Unlike solitary confinement systems which isolated prisoners completely, the Auburn system allowed inmates to interact physically but not verbally, creating a controlled environment where conformity and discipline were prioritized above all else. Labor was another cornerstone of the Auburn system. Prisoners worked together in workshops producing goods such as furniture, clothing, shoes, and other manufactured items. This labor served multiple purposes. It instilled a sense of routine and responsibility, generated revenue for the facility, and reinforced the idea that prisoners must earn their keep through productive work. The economic aspect of the system made Auburn largely self-sufficient, as the sale of goods produced by inmates helped fund the prison's operations and reduce reliance on taxpayer money. Physical discipline was integral to enforcing the Auburn system. Punishments were strict and often harsh, designed to maintain order and deter disobedience. Flogging, solitary confinement, and extended periods of enforced silence were common methods of maintaining compliance. These measures reflected a belief that strict control and immediate consequences were necessary to reshape behavior and prepare prisoners for eventual reintegration into society. The combination of labor, silence, and corporal discipline created a regimented daily life that left little room for personal freedom or deviation from rules. The Auburn system gained national recognition quickly. Prison administrators, reformers, and government officials from across the United States visited Auburn to observe its methods and implement similar systems in their own states. The success of Auburn's structured approach to labor and discipline inspired the construction of other facilities modeled on its principles. Over time, the Auburn system became one of the dominant approaches to incarceration in the United States, shaping the development of maximum security prisons and informing policy debates about the balance between punishment, rehabilitation, and security. One of the distinguishing features of the Auburn system was its ability to blend punishment with potential rehabilitation. While the methods were harsh, the structured labor and strict rules were also intended to teach inmates skills that could be used upon release. Workshops provided training in trades like carpentry, shoemaking, and metalwork, which could potentially help prisoners earn a living outside prison walls. In this sense, the Auburn system was not purely punitive. It aimed to instill discipline while preparing inmates for eventual reintegration into society. Despite its influence and recognition, the Auburn system was also a subject of controversy. Critics argued that the enforced silence and physical discipline were inhumane and could lead to psychological harm. Others questioned whether the system truly rehabilitated offenders or merely imposed conformity through fear. Nevertheless, Auburn's methods became a foundation for the modern American penal system, influencing prison architecture, daily routines, and correctional philosophy for decades. The legacy of the Auburn system continues to be felt today. Modern correctional facilities still incorporate elements of regimented labor, structured routines, and strict discipline, albeit in less severe and more humane forms. Auburn Correctional Facility remains a symbol of this historical shift in American penology, a living monument to the experimentation, innovation, and sometimes harsh realities that defined the early days of the U.S. prison system. Its enduring presence offers insight into how punishment, labor, and discipline have been intertwined in the effort to manage crime and shape behavior, leaving a lasting imprint on the way society views incarceration and rehabilitation. One of the most defining and infamous aspects of the Auburn Correctional Facility was its strict enforcement of the silent movement, or silence rule, a practice that became central to its identity and the broader Auburn system. Unlike other early prisons where inmates might congregate, talk, or socialize freely, Auburn demanded total silence at almost all times, creating a unique and psychologically intense environment that profoundly shaped the lives of its prisoners. This rule was not a mere suggestion. It was a core principle of the facility, strictly monitored and harshly enforced, reflecting the 19th century belief that control over speech and communication could enforce moral and behavioral reform. The silence rule applied to every facet of prison life. During work hours in the workshops, prisoners labored side by side but were forbidden from speaking to one another. Meals were eaten in complete quiet, and even walking through the corridors or performing basic tasks required total restraint from conversation. Guards constantly monitored inmates for any infraction, and any attempt to communicate, whether verbally or through gestures, could result in immediate punishment. The idea was that by stripping prisoners of their ability to communicate freely, they would be forced to confront their own thoughts, accept discipline, and adhere to the rules without resistance. The origins of the silent movement rule were rooted in early theories of rehabilitation. Reformers believed that criminals were morally corrupt and that allowing social interaction among inmates could reinforce criminal behavior. By enforcing silence, Auburn's administrators aimed to prevent the spread of criminal ideas, control the social environment, and impose order over a population that might otherwise resist authority. The rule was also intended to break down individual pride and ego, promoting conformity and obedience, qualities considered essential for eventual reintegration into a law-abiding society. Implementing such a strict silence rule required a combination of architectural design and constant supervision. Auburn cell blocks were constructed in a way that allowed guards to observe prisoners continuously, and workshops were organized to ensure that inmates worked in regimented rows, under constant watch. Even small sounds, whispers, or attempts at secret communication could not escape notice. This created an environment where prisoners lived under continuous psychological pressure, aware that a single misstep could lead to severe consequences. The punishments for violating the silence rule were severe and often brutal. Offenders could be placed in solitary confinement for days or weeks, subjected to physical beatings, or denied privileges such as food, recreation, or work opportunities. In extreme cases, repeated infractions could result in corporal punishment or extended confinement under harsher conditions. The constant threat of punishment instilled fear and compliance, reinforcing the overarching principle that obedience was non-negotiable and that every action, no matter how small, was scrutinized. The silent movement rule had profound effects on prisoner psychology. Some inmates adapted to the oppressive environment, internalizing the discipline and learning to navigate the strictures of daily life. Others suffered mental strain, isolation, and anxiety, which could exacerbate existing psychological issues. Historians and reformers later criticized this aspect of the Auburn system, arguing that enforced silence could lead to long-term emotional damage, social withdrawal, and stunted interpersonal skills. Yet at the time, the practice was considered revolutionary, representing a scientific approach to controlling human behavior through environmental manipulation and strict regulation. Interestingly, the silent movement rule also influenced prison culture in unexpected ways. The total restriction on verbal communication forced inmates to develop alternative forms of expression. Subtle gestures, coded signals, and careful observation became part of daily life, allowing prisoners to communicate covertly while technically adhering to the rules. This unspoken language created a paradox. While the rule aimed to suppress social interaction, it inadvertently encouraged the development of creative and secretive methods of connection among inmates. Beyond its impact on prisoners, the silent movement rule made Auburn a model for other correctional facilities. Observers and reformers from across the United States studied the system, and many incorporated elements of the silence rule into their own prisons. The idea that controlled behavior, enforced through structured routines and strict rules, could maintain order became a cornerstone of the American penal system, influencing the design, operations, and philosophy of countless facilities for decades to come. In essence, the silent movement rule at Auburn was more than a disciplinary measure. It was a reflection of 19th-century beliefs about crime, morality, and social control. It demonstrated a willingness to experiment with psychological techniques and environmental manipulation in the pursuit of correction and reform. While controversial and often criticized, the rule left an indelible mark on the history of incarceration, shaping not only the daily lives of Auburn inmates but also the broader development of American prison systems. The legacy of enforced silence continues to be studied as a stark example of how punishment, psychology, and control intersected in one of America's oldest correctional facilities. Auburn Correctional Facility holds a grim place in history as one of the early sites for executions by electric chair, a method that forever changed the landscape of capital punishment in the United States. In 1890, Auburn became a central stage for this new, controversial approach to execution, marking a shift from more traditional forms of capital punishment, such as hanging, which had been standard for centuries. The introduction of the electric chair represented not only a technological innovation but also a reflection of the era's evolving views on justice, deterrence, and the modernization of punishment. The adoption of the electric chair was largely influenced by the desire to find a more humane and efficient method of execution. Public hangings had long been criticized for their brutality, unpredictability, and the spectacle they created. Reformers, inventors, and prison officials sought an alternative that could deliver death quickly and in theory with less suffering. Auburn Correctional Facility, with its reputation for discipline and order, was chosen as one of the sites to implement this new method, positioning the prison at the forefront of a national experiment in the administration of justice. The first execution by electric chair at Auburn was highly publicized and closely monitored. This event signaled a willingness by authorities to embrace modern technology as a tool for law enforcement, reflecting the era's fascination with scientific progress and efficiency. The electric chair was seen as a symbol of modernity, a mechanical, precise, and seemingly clinical method to carry out the ultimate punishment. Auburn's adoption of this technology placed the prison at the center of national attention, drawing observers, journalists, and reform advocates eager to witness the results and assess its effectiveness. In addition to its technological significance, the use of the electric chair at Auburn also carried profound psychological and cultural implications. The introduction of electricity as a means of execution created an aura of fear and inevitability around capital punishment. Inmates were made acutely aware that disobedience or crime could lead to a highly mechanized and inescapable form of death, amplifying the prison's role in instilling discipline and control. The symbolic power of the electric chair reinforced Auburn's identity as a place where both law and technology combined to enforce ultimate authority over life and death. The physical setup for electric chair executions at Auburn was carefully designed to reflect both security and ritual. The chair itself was placed in a controlled environment within the prison, typically surrounded by guards, prison officials, and selected witnesses. The process was methodical, emphasizing precision, order, and the careful application of the new technology. While intended to appear humane, early executions were not without problems. Equipment failures, improper settings, and the inexperience of operators sometimes resulted in gruesome outcomes. These incidents fueled public debate over the ethics and humanity of using electricity to execute prisoners. The introduction of the electric chair at Auburn also marked the beginning of widespread debate about the morality of capital punishment and the ethics of new execution methods. Critics argued that the method, though technologically advanced, did not eliminate suffering and introduced a cold, clinical approach to human life that many considered morally objectionable. Advocates, on the other hand, believed that the electric chair represented progress, a way to carry out justice efficiently while avoiding the more visible and theatrical brutality of public hangings. Auburn thus became a focal point in the national conversation about the intersection of law, technology, and morality. Beyond its immediate impact, Auburn's early adoption of the electric chair influenced other prisons across the country. States observed the results and often adopted similar practices, leading to the electric chair becoming the predominant method of execution in the United States for much of the 20th century. Auburn's role in this transition highlights the prison's historical importance not only as a site of incarceration but also as a testing ground for innovations in the administration of capital punishment. Moreover, the history of the electric chair at Auburn intersects with the broader story of the prison's strict discipline system. The same environment that enforced silence, labor, and harsh punishments also became a place where society's ultimate punitive measure was applied. The juxtaposition of everyday discipline with the finality of execution underscored the dual role of Auburn, It was both a training ground for obedience and a theater where life and death authority was exercised. In this sense, Auburn was a microcosm of the 19th century American approach to criminal justice, blending experimentation, order, discipline, and the search for modern methods of punishment. Ultimately, Auburn's early use of the electric chair left a lasting imprint on American history. It symbolizes the prison's central role in shaping not only the daily lives of inmates but also the nation's approach to capital punishment. The facility became a historical benchmark, demonstrating the evolving intersection of technology, law, and morality in the justice system. By hosting one of the first electric chair executions, Auburn Correctional Facility secured its place in the history of punishment as an institution willing to innovate, enforce strict discipline, and confront the ethical dilemmas posed by new forms of state-sanctioned authority. Auburn Correctional Facility is notorious for its harsh living conditions, which defined the daily experience of inmates and became a hallmark of its reputation. From the moment a prisoner entered Auburn's massive stone walls, they were confronted with an environment designed to enforce discipline, obedience, and psychological control. The conditions were far from comfortable. Overcrowding, hard labor, and strict rules created a daily struggle for survival, both physically and mentally, leaving an indelible mark on the history of American incarceration. One of the most immediate challenges faced by inmates was overcrowding. Auburn, like many prisons of the 19th and early 20th centuries, often housed far more prisoners than it was originally designed to accommodate. Cells intended for 1 or 2 individuals frequently contained 3, 4, or even more men, forcing inmates into cramped quarters where privacy was nearly impossible. This lack of personal space intensified tension among prisoners, increasing the likelihood of conflict, anxiety, and stress. Overcrowding also made sanitation and hygiene difficult to maintain, contributing to the spread of disease and compounding the harshness of daily life. In addition to overcrowding, physical labor was a central feature of life at Auburn. Prisoners were required to work long hours, often in workshops producing furniture, clothing, shoes, and other goods. This labor was demanding and relentless, leaving inmates little time for rest or recreation. The work was not merely a task, it was a method of control, a tool to instill discipline, and, in theory, a way to teach productive skills. However, the combination of physical strain, strict supervision, and enforced silence made the experience grueling, with prisoners often pushed to the limits of exhaustion. Food and nutrition were another aspect of the harsh living conditions. Meals were basic and often insufficient to meet the physical demands placed on inmates. Bland, monotonous diets of bread, porridge, and thin soups left prisoners malnourished and weak, further amplifying the challenges of hard labor. The limited food supply was also used as a tool of discipline. Privileges could be withheld as punishment for disobedience, reinforcing the connection between compliance and survival. Sanitary conditions in Auburn were minimal, reflecting the broader norms of the era but still adding to the harshness of prison life. Inmates shared communal bathrooms and were often forced to endure crowded sleeping quarters with little ventilation. The spread of disease was a constant threat, and medical care was limited and rudimentary. In such an environment, illness could become severe and sometimes fatal, underscoring the vulnerability of prisoners and the harsh realities of confinement. The regimented schedule of Auburn further reinforced the severity of living conditions. Every aspect of a prisoner's day, work, meals, recreation, and rest, was strictly timed and controlled. Prisoners had little autonomy, and deviation from the prescribed schedule could result in immediate punishment. The constant oversight created an atmosphere of psychological pressure, where even minor infractions could lead to solitary confinement, flogging, or other forms of harsh discipline. In this way, the living conditions were as much psychological as physical, designed to break resistance and enforce obedience. Auburn's strict silence rule compounded the difficulty of daily life. Prisoners were not allowed to communicate verbally with each other, whether during labor, meals, or leisure. This prohibition created an isolating environment, even when inmates were physically near one another. The inability to speak or express oneself freely added a layer of mental strain, as prisoners had to navigate social interaction through nonverbal means while constantly fearing punishment for any infraction. This enforced isolation heightened the sense of alienation and reinforced the prison's control over every aspect of an inmate's existence. The harsh living conditions were not only a tool of punishment but also reflected broader societal beliefs about crime and morality during Auburn's early years. Reformers and prison administrators believed that strict discipline, hard labor, and deprivation could correct moral failings, instill obedience, and ultimately prepare prisoners for eventual reintegration into society. The physical and psychological rigors of Auburn were seen as necessary components of this corrective process, though critics often questioned whether the methods were excessive and inhumane. Despite the brutality, the harsh living conditions at Auburn also fostered a unique culture within the prison. Prisoners developed coping mechanisms, such as strict adherence to routines, silent observation of others, and the use of subtle gestures to communicate covertly. These adaptations demonstrate the resilience of human beings even in extreme conditions, but they also highlight the profound impact that Auburn's environment had on shaping inmate behavior, psychology, and social interactions. In summary, the harsh living conditions at Auburn Correctional Facility defined the daily existence of its inmates and became a defining feature of the prison's legacy. Overcrowding, grueling labor, inadequate nutrition, minimal sanitation, strict schedules, and enforced silence combined to create an environment of intense physical and psychological pressure. These conditions reflected the 19th century philosophy of punishment and reform, leaving an enduring imprint on both the prisoners who endured them and the broader history of the American penal system. Auburn's walls not only confined bodies but also sought to control minds, illustrating the extreme measures once considered necessary to maintain order, enforce discipline, and instill obedience within one of the nation's oldest and most infamous correctional facilities. Auburn Correctional Facility became infamous not only for its labor, silence, and harsh living conditions but also for its strict physical discipline system, which was central to maintaining order and control within the prison. Discipline at Auburn went far beyond mere enforcement of rules. It was an all-encompassing regime that dictated nearly every aspect of a prisoner's life, reflecting 19th century beliefs about crime, punishment, and moral reform. The combination of punishment, fear, and psychological pressure was considered essential to maintain obedience and prevent disorder in a population of confined individuals with little personal freedom. The physical discipline system at Auburn was rooted in the philosophy that strict, often severe, punishment could correct behavior and instill moral values. Guards and prison administrators believed that criminals were fundamentally corrupt and that it was the state's responsibility to impose rigorous control to reform them. Any deviation from rules, whether talking during work, disobeying orders, or showing signs of defiance, could trigger immediate punishment. The primary goal was to make disobedience unthinkable and compliance habitual, shaping the prisoner not only physically but mentally. Corporal punishment was a key component of Auburn's disciplinary methods. Flogging and beatings were common, especially in the early years of the prison's operation. The severity of the punishment varied depending on the offense, but even minor infractions could result in lashings or physical reprimands. These punishments were administered publicly, serving as both a deterrent for others and a means of reinforcing the authority of the prison staff. Public displays of discipline made it clear that rules were absolute and that breaking them would have immediate, tangible consequences. Solitary confinement was another integral aspect of Auburn's disciplinary system. Prisoners who violated rules or engaged in misconduct could be isolated for days, weeks, or even months. During solitary confinement, inmates were confined to small, dark cells with minimal human contact, food, and comfort. The goal was to remove any external stimulation, forcing prisoners to reflect on their behavior and accept the consequences of their actions. Solitary confinement was particularly feared because it combined physical deprivation with extreme psychological pressure, making it one of the most effective tools of control within Auburn's system. The discipline system also extended to work routines. Prisoners were required to perform physically demanding labor for long hours under strict supervision. Guards ensured that every task was completed precisely and that no deviation from rules occurred. Mistakes, perceived slowness, or lack of effort could result in punishment, which reinforced the idea that obedience and diligence were mandatory. This rigorous enforcement of discipline during labor not only maintained order but also served to reinforce the connection between hard work, obedience, and survival within the prison system. Beyond physical punishment, psychological methods were used to enforce discipline at Auburn. The prison's enforced silence, regimented schedules, and rigid hierarchical structures created an environment where prisoners were constantly monitored and pressured to conform. Fear, uncertainty, and the knowledge that even minor infractions could trigger harsh consequences were central to maintaining control. Prisoners had to learn to anticipate rules, suppress their impulses, and adjust behavior constantly to avoid punishment. In this way, discipline at Auburn was as much about shaping the mind as it was about controlling the body. The Auburn discipline system was also reinforced through the prison's architectural and operational design. Cells, corridors, and workspaces were arranged to allow constant surveillance by guards. Inmates were rarely out of sight, and their movements, behaviors, and interactions were continuously monitored. This design ensured that discipline was omnipresent, a silent but constant force that reminded prisoners that every action was observed and every misstep could carry consequences. Even minor gestures or whispers could result in punishment, making vigilance a survival skill. While controversial, Auburn's strict discipline system became a model for other prisons across the United States. Correctional facilities adopted similar methods, emphasizing labor, silence, corporal punishment, and solitary confinement to maintain order. Auburn's practices shaped not only the physical and operational design of American prisons but also the philosophical approach to incarceration, reinforcing the belief that strict discipline was a necessary component of reform and social control. The long-term effects of this disciplinary system on prisoners were profound. Many inmates experienced lasting psychological stress, social withdrawal, and trauma from years of strict control and harsh punishment. Yet, some also adapted to the structured environment, developing resilience, coping mechanisms, and skills that helped them navigate both prison life and eventual reintegration into society. Auburn's discipline system therefore left a dual legacy, one of suffering and control, but also one that influenced the development of modern correctional techniques and ideas about rehabilitation. In conclusion, the physical discipline system at Auburn Correctional Facility was central to its identity and operations. It combined corporal punishment, solitary confinement, psychological pressure, and regimented labor to create an environment of strict obedience and control. This system reflected the prevailing beliefs about crime and punishment during the 19th century, shaping both the daily lives of inmates and the broader philosophy of American incarceration. Auburn's approach to discipline became a model for prisons nationwide, leaving a lasting impact on the history of corrections and demonstrating the extreme measures once considered necessary to maintain order, instill obedience, and attempt moral reform within one of the nation's oldest correctional institutions. Auburn Correctional Facility's legacy is a complex blend of innovation, controversy, and influence, reflecting the evolution of the American prison system from harsh punishment toward modern debates about rehabilitation and human rights. While Auburn is often remembered for its strict discipline, harsh living conditions, and early use of the electric chair, its enduring significance lies in the lessons it provides about how incarceration has been shaped by social, economic, and philosophical forces over more than 2 centuries. From its inception in 1816, Auburn was not merely a building to confine criminals. It was a testing ground for ideas about crime, punishment, and behavioral reform. The philosophies behind its operations, the Auburn System, strict silence rules, enforced labor, and physical discipline, were revolutionary in their time and would influence the development of prisons across the United States. Auburn's practices introduced a model where control over both physical actions and psychological behavior was seen as essential for maintaining order, teaching obedience, and preparing inmates for eventual reintegration into society. This model became a reference point for prison administrators nationwide, shaping policies, architecture, and correctional methods for decades. Despite its influence, Auburn has always been controversial. The severity of its discipline, the physical and psychological toll on inmates, and the use of extreme measures such as corporal punishment and the electric chair have been widely criticized by reformers, humanitarians, and historians. Many argued that the prison system at Auburn prioritized obedience and control over rehabilitation, often inflicting suffering that went beyond what was necessary for justice. Reports from the 19th and 20th centuries documented the harsh conditions, strict enforcement of silence, and brutal punishments that prisoners endured, raising questions about the ethics and humanity of such an approach. These controversies contributed to ongoing debates about the purpose of prisons, the balance between punishment and rehabilitation, and the rights of incarcerated individuals. Auburn's role in shaping the American penal system cannot be understated. The Auburn System, combining labor with enforced silence and strict discipline, became one of the dominant models for prisons in the United States. States and administrators across the nation studied its operations, architecture, and management strategies, incorporating similar methods into their own correctional facilities. Auburn also set precedents for the use of labor as both a disciplinary tool and a source of revenue, influencing the economic aspects of prison management. Even today, elements of Auburn's approach, regimented routines, labor programs, and strict rule enforcement, can be seen in modern correctional institutions, though often implemented in more humane and regulated ways. Another important aspect of Auburn's legacy is its impact on the development of capital punishment in America. As one of the first prisons to use the electric chair, Auburn played a pivotal role in the modernization of executions. This innovation reflected broader social trends toward technological solutions in governance and law enforcement, but also sparked enduring debates about morality, humaneness, and the role of the state in administering death. The prison's association with early electric chair executions remains a significant part of its historical narrative, highlighting the tension between progress, efficiency, and ethics in the criminal justice system. Auburn's longevity also contributes to its historical significance. Operating continuously for more than 2 centuries, it has witnessed changes in law, social attitudes, and correctional philosophy. From the harsh punitive models of the 19th century to the evolving emphasis on rehabilitation, education, and prisoner rights in the modern era, Auburn has been a living record of American incarceration. Its walls contain stories of generations of inmates, reflecting both suffering and resilience, mistakes and reforms, and the complex interplay between authority and human behavior. The prison's history also serves as a reminder of the broader societal forces that shape incarceration. Auburn was not isolated. Its policies, design, and operations reflected prevailing social attitudes about crime, morality, labor, and social control. The facility illustrates how prisons can serve as instruments of both punishment and social engineering, where the goals of reform, deterrence, and order intersect, sometimes with unintended consequences. This makes Auburn an important case study for understanding not only historical practices but also contemporary debates about prison reform, mass incarceration, and human rights. In conclusion, the legacy of Auburn Correctional Facility is multifaceted. It is a story of innovation and influence, controversy and cruelty, discipline and resilience. As one of the oldest prisons in the United States, Auburn represents the evolution of American incarceration, from rigid, punitive systems to more modern debates about rehabilitation, ethics, and prisoner rights. Its practices, both criticized and celebrated, continue to shape our understanding of correctional philosophy, the administration of justice, and the complex relationship between society and those it confines. Auburn stands as a testament to the enduring challenges of balancing order, punishment, and humanity within the walls of a prison, making it an institution whose history continues to resonate in discussions about criminal justice today.